Okay, let's go ahead and get started with our next presentation. Our next presentation is, I get to say this, I get to use some of my Italian. Argento e Rosso, an alternate history of the mid-engine revolution by Karl-Heinz Mertins. I love this topic. This is one of those things, thinking out contrafactual history is something that's being used a lot now to examine different events in history. And I love this. So I'm going to turn it back. I'm looking forward to this one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should be good now. Yep.
Okay. Did it really need to take 25 years from the first cars that were winning Grand Prix races with the engine mounted behind the driver until it became commonplace, and then all the US Grand Prix that were held here at this wonderful racetrack were all contested by and won by cars that had the engine mounted behind the driver. It seemed to be the most normal thing in the world. So let me run you through a few stages of what happened in reality, and then I will veer off into what I would submit as an alternative reality. And you can dispute that, and you can criticize me for some of the stupidities that I will throw out here. But it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and now in retirement I've had time to really devote some quality time to this topic, and I want to share this with you, but I invite you to be critical with me. So I start here at the year 1937, and this is just one of the races that were counting towards the European Championship of drivers. And what you see here is the typical view in those years. There are many silver cars, and they have just a sprinkle of red. There's a lot of Argento, a little sprinkle of Rosso in this image. The lone Alfa Romeo here of Tasio Nuvolari. In the pole position here is Bernd Rosemeyer in an Auto Union race car, and as you may deduct here, the engine is really mounted behind the driver, whereas all the Mercedes cars in the vicinity here, Hermann Lang and Caracciola here, they all have the typical classical front-engined cars, just like the Thomas Flyer that we learned about on Thursday evening, had the engine mounted in front of the person that drives the car, or the two people that were sitting there. That seemed to be the norm. Why even question that? And yet we know from many instances in industry, in art and so on, things change, and sometimes they have to change for good reasons. But what was the underlying situation here, I want to point out quickly, was that this happened all under the 750 kilogram formula. that the CSI brought into action because the previous cars were getting too fast and too powerful. And the thought was, well, if you limit the weight of the dry weight of the car to 750 kilograms, then not much can happen. The engines will have to become smaller, and there is just no chance for increase in performance and perhaps decrease in safety of running these cars on the given tracks. The opposite happened. The rule makers did not really anticipate the tremendous progress that happened in metallurgy, in engineering in general, in tires, in many areas that compose the car. And what happened was the technical complexity went up dramatically. The performance of these cars compared to the previous ones went up dramatically, and the dominance that was held by the red cars, the Rosso element, switched over to the Argento, to the silver cars, the ones that happened to be made in Germany, where I also come from. And as you see in the results here, the first three finishers were silver cars, Mercedes in the first two places, Auto Unione number 3, and Tasio Nuvolari with several minutes distance came in as fourth. 2 years prior, by the way, he had won this race because this man, von Brauchitsch, was abusing his tires, and he didn't want to stop for a second tire change, and he paid heavily for that, and Nuvolari was the winner, the surprise winner. The organizers were not prepared to have a foreigner win the German Grand Prix. They were struggling to get the national anthem dug out and all those things. And it took a while for the spectators to recognize that they had a different winner than what they had expected. So there were a number of things happening under the 750 kilogram formula, but by and large it was a duel between the silver arrows of Mercedes-Benz and Auto Unione. This period was one of disruptions. I think what became evident was that a complex car could no longer be designed and constructed by a singular genius or an artisan, a craftsperson. It went to teams of specialists that replaced those individuals. That was difficult for some people, and as an example, Ettore Bugatti perhaps, and more pertinent to this talk than Vittorio Jano, were more in this category. I would say they may not have been the best leaders of a team of specialists, and that's what came about. You can see here the Mercedes core team of their racing department, led by Uhlenhaut. And he was also the person that focused very much on a new chassis paradigm, where previously chassis were pretty flimsy affairs, and the wheel suspension was pretty hard. And the chassis was basically the suspension system, spring system. That changed dramatically when the chassis was fortified and became much more stable. We also saw, as in the previous image, that the mid-engined car concept became competitive. It was almost equal to the conventionals. So when that happened in a very short period of time, that's pretty amazing and should tell people that there's something to it, because typically it takes a while for the new challenger to challenge an incumbent, because the incumbent has naturally some 50 years of experience to refine the concept. So this was telling. I think also the fascist governments in Italy and in Germany started to use and abuse GP racing for propaganda purposes. So it was no longer a matter of the individual driver and the team to be successful. Now you had to be successful for the whole nation, or you would be criticized by masses and by the leadership. There were state subsidies paid in Germany, but they were relative minor contributions to the overall budget. This space race, so to speak, that happened in Germany was much more expensive than, say, the sums that were paid by the government. Going forward, Mercedes was well known, of course, but the challenger was Auto Union, not really an organization with a long history. Well, it was a company that was born out of necessity. There were 4 companies in Saxony, in Germany, and they were closely related geographically, but they all 4 had the same financial troubles, and they had difficulties growing. The banks, namely the Saxon State Bank, was very worried about their investments, and they said something needs to change here. Why don't we bring those 4 companies together and work towards economies of scale? So in 1932, those 4 companies, previously independent, Audi, DKW, or DKW, Horch and Wanderer, were brought together into this Auto Union AG. The company kept a multiple brand strategy. When you look at these bar graphs, you see that the portion of the bars here stands for the DKW contribution here. A very simple and low-cost car made the majority of this business in terms of volume, sold cars per year. And you can see over the years there was quite an increase. The company, Auto Union, became the number 2 in Germany, but not many people knew about the name and could relate the name to specific projects and products. So either they had to go big time into advertising or to go racing and make a name for themselves. Now, Wanderer, one of the 4 constituents, had already had a good relationship with Dr. Porsche's, Ferdinand Porsche's engineering office out of Stuttgart, and he had designed some of the very successful Wanderer cars and engines for those 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder. And he also had plans already in his back pocket for a car for this, what was called then the P-Wagen or P-Wagen, a 4.4-liter V16 Grand Prix car with the engine mounted behind the driver. Wanderer was almost sold on it, but they had to get approval from the Auto Union holding company. It took a while to get there, but finally that came to pass, particularly when the political landscape shifted around at this time, and Hitler came into power, and he was very much into mass mobilization and automobile propagation, and he wanted to demonstrate, of course, the essential superpower of the German nation, and it could be demonstrated in some sort of a space race that at that point was auto racing. Now, the Porsche design, quite intricate and complex, was only that. It was a design. Porsche's engineering office did not build anything really other than some rough prototypes. So it had to be done within Auto Union, that they had to come up with a real car, and that was, the task was given to this gentleman here who smokes, and the full picture would show there's a race car in his vicinity, and this is taken at the boxes. And it was Robert Eberan von Eberhorst, and his statement was from the get-go, he was completely convinced that this, what he then called the rear engine concept, was really the real deal, and he was fully behind propagating that. Here we learn a little bit more about Ferdinand Porsche's P-Wagen, as documented in patent literature here. And what you see here in particular is, of course, the general concept of the car. The engine is here, the gearbox cantilevering behind the rear axle. But what he pointed out in this particular patent text, and it claims, was that the line here, the yellow line, which is close to what we today would call the roll axis of the vehicle. In those days, the term had not been coined, but he pointed out this axle was very important, and it should go through the center of gravity of the unsprung masses. When that was accomplished, then there would be no sideway inclinations of the car, and they would be absolutely done with, and the car would really hold the road like a board sliding over the road. There would be no tilting or rolling of the car. You can see a little bit here, Bernd Rosemeyer negotiating a corner at the Donington circuit in England. And you can see that there's not much roll here, but there's a lot of oversteer and opposite lock. And it wasn't easy to control these cars at the time, because there's a bit of a flaw in this concept that looks good on paper, that there should be no roll. A roll is a pretty good previous or early indicator that the car is getting closer to its limits, the adhesion limits of the tires. And so you want to have a little bit of roll, otherwise the driver will get much more surprised by the rear stepping out. But that was a lesson after World War II. We skipped that dark part of history. The silver arrows were pretty much out of business. The Auto Union, as it was known then, was out of business. It was partially located in the Russian zone, what became then East Germany, and the smart people that worked there tried to get out of Dodge as quickly as possible, and they reestablished some smaller organization in West Germany, a new Auto Union, but not nearly as potent as the original was. And Mercedes-Benz, the factories were in smithereens, and they had to slowly rebuild their core business. Alfa Romeo, on the other hand, had a couple of challengers for post-World War II Grand Prix racing at their disposal. They were smart enough to hide those assets well, protect them throughout the war, and they had two concepts. And one was what we know as the 158 Alfetta, which was a conventional car with the engine in front. And there was the second one that was the 512 that was very much modeled after the Auto Union race cars. And you can see here, it had a very high roll center in the rear axle, and it pretty much copied the same slope of the roll axis as the Porsche patented outlined. This was more or less a brainchild or a project directed by Wilfredo Ricard, who was a very theoretical man, studied, not necessarily the most practical person, and not a person who interacted well with the more practical people, maybe the previous artisan generation. There was a bit of a wall between them. So he persisted with this relatively high roll center here. The Didion axle at the back shows that. There's a Watts linkage in this resolution of this image. It doesn't show very well, but this red arrow points to it. It was an unusual high placement of the roll center, the lateral arresting point, if you want so, of the Didion tube. And so that was a bit of a flaw, hence there were some issues with the road holding of that prototype. There were almost two 512s completed. The first one was tested in 1940. It showed some difficulties with road holding. Now, on the other hand, the 158 had its own chassis impairments that would show up later as the engine horsepower increased quite dramatically. But for now, you could argue when Alfa Romeo decided what to go racing with after World War II, the Alfetta was the more reasonable choice. Early on, way back when I first thought about this alternative history thing, this seemed to be a perfect deviation point, where you deviate from real history into La La Land. And my first thought was, why don't we just shift from one car to the mid-engined car, the 512? Well, it is not quite that easy as it showed once I dug in, once I did a little bit of my way of research and dug into literature and all kinds of prior art that existed at the time. It seemed that there were issues, obviously, in the design, which could have been changed and further developed. However, when Ugo Gobato, who was running Alfa Romeo at the time, was assassinated in 1945, Ricard, who came originally from Spain, felt for his own safety it was best to go back to Barcelona. And he had not made many friends within the Alfa organization, so when he left, there were not many disciples that would have picked up and would have continued the development of this quite visionary design of the 512. The engine, by the way, was certainly a superior element in that whole design compared to the 158. So the revolution was suspended, and my story couldn't pivot at that point. Now, in the meantime, while Alfa Romeo was quite successful and earned the Driver World Championship in 1950 and 51, at the beginning of the Formula One as we know it, Mercedes was still rebuilding the core business, but they had declared already in 51 that by 54, when the new 2.5-liter Formula One would come into being, that they would start participating in it. Now, they had a new project leader in Hans Schernberg, but they also had some of the old experienced guys like Alfred Neubauer, Rudolf Uhlenhaut at their disposal to start building this next generation of Silver Arrow. And they had roughly 200 staff members at their disposal, which is a huge number of engineers and technicians and fabricators in those days. So they were going all out. They were not kidding when they said in 54 we want to be on the racetrack again. And they had further access to about 300 specialists within the corporation that they could get information from on a part-time basis. So there was a lot of potential there in terms of engineering horsepower, know-how. They also worked quite well with Bosch, that they had been working with as a partner during World War II on fuel injection systems. So they got a lot of help there in optimizing their direct fuel injection system, which was also an improvement over competition. And so you wondered who could be an opponent for this onslaught by Mercedes-Benz after World War II. Certainly none of the German companies. We had already briefly stressed Auto Union, the newly formed GmbH, wasn't really in a position to do that. They didn't have the means. Borgward, who was kind of a multi-brand cluster of companies as well, they were into touring car racing to some extent. Veritas was a very small-scale builder of race cars, kind of a Silver Arrow that they tried, and they used the BMW 328 engine for their efforts. Well, as they were not that successful, BMW asked them to stop using their engine, and then they had to make their own engine, and they dabbled with two-cycle engines. And they wouldn't go anywhere. They didn't have anywhere near these resources. So that didn't work out well. Meanwhile, in Italy, after Alfa Romeo was already quite successful with the pre-war designs, and they were thinking about they needed to have a new design in order to stay competitive. Loraghi, who was then running Alfa Romeo, and his leadership team felt it was enough with racing, and it was good to stop at the height of their success rather than continuing and risking to lose the glory that they had accumulated. Ferrari was, particularly in the context of mid-engined cars, a big opponent. To him, the ox or horse always must pull the cart. That was his thought. Kind of a faulty analogy, because even front-engined cars push the car as long as it's rear-wheel driven. And then there was Cisitalia, who was a small company with huge ambitions, and they had contracted the Porsche engineering team to design the 360, a very advanced mid-engined Formula car, Grand Prix car, that was very complex, and Duzio, who owned Cisitalia at the time, was way over his head, I think, in terms of financial commitments and understanding how much it would take beyond the initial design of a car. You have to field it, and then you have to also be aware that when you start, even if you're very competitive at the beginning, the competition isn't going to sleep. There will be upgrades, and you will have to upgrade yours. And so they just didn't have, based on their relatively small, tiny boutique car company with beautiful cars, with bodywork styled by Farina, and they were popular, but they didn't make much money, so there wasn't anywhere near the financial wherewithal to support a Grand Prix project like this. The engine, by the time 54 would roll in, the 1.5-liter turbocharged engine, or supercharged engine, I should say, was obsolete. So they would have to get a different engine. But by 49, Cisitalia was pretty much bankrupt, and Duzio took the car and himself over to Argentina, and there was no real engineering support. So this project, which was very promising, died out before it ever really got onto a racetrack. Also, they waited way too long to do the first on-track tests. They wanted to build 6 cars, ideally, and then think it was perfect to go racing. So they didn't really worry much about the four-wheel drive that was part of this car, and to try it out and to understand how does it work on straight ahead and in curves and so on. So there was a lot of over-optimism that ruled that project. Scuderia Milan was even more optimistic in coming up with a kind of a raw prototype of a mid-engined car that had a transversely mounted 8-cylinder engine, air-cooled, without showing any serious means of getting rid of the heat that this very powerful engine would generate. So, and they certainly didn't have the wherewithal, so I would say don't do that. Now, of course, the real history shows us this, and Chris Nixon shows in his book very well. There was a rival to Mercedes-Benz in the form of the Lancia D50, but I submit, and you can shoot me for that, Lancia was not really in a position to get into Grand Prix racing. They didn't have the financial wherewithal. Gianni Lancia, who was running the company then, should have been told to pivot more to the money-making side of the business and hold back for now on the passionate racing enterprise. So I don't think that was real. Also, although they had a car that, after some development, showed promise and could have challenged Mercedes, they could probably not withstand the ongoing upgrades and competition that would raise the bar. So my conclusion here is there was no single entity in Italy or elsewhere in France or England that could really mount a challenge to Mercedes-Benz, and therefore something else would have to happen in order to fulfill my dream of propelling forward the change to rear-engined cars. So I've defined 2 conditions that are necessary for enduring Grand Prix success. It probably pertains to other classes as well. An effective project has to have a solid funding and a long-term commitment. It can't just be a commitment we heard that earlier about the advertising industry that may chip in. It has to be more than 1 year. It has to be an extended commitment from a potent industrial corporation, I would say. Doesn't necessarily have to be a car company, as Red Bull today demonstrates this, but it should preferably be one. And I would submit as a second condition, a component supplier should be involved also. And particularly since either tires or fuel are playing a big role in the ultimate performance of the car, maybe one of those suppliers should be involved actively, not just putting their labels on the car, but being actively involved in the development process because they have some skin in the game, financially, but also image-wise. And so when you have these two conditions fulfilled, I think then you have a good shot at being ultimately successful. And I bring forward two examples here for your consideration, although they extend a little bit beyond the time period I'm talking about. But there is the Fenwal effort to bring British racing green into the forefront of Grand Prix racing. And Tony van der Wel, who was very committed, who had the wherewithals, he was the head of a large corporation that built sliding bearings for engines for the car industry and some other things. Among other things, he owned Lucas, was responsible for the Prince of Darkness. And so far, there was some potency there. And over years, first he started out with modified Ferraris, as you know. Then he pivoted towards his own design and was ultimately successful. In 1958, he won the first Constructors' Championship, which was then open for the first year. Not the Drivers' Championship that went to Mike Hawthorne on a Ferrari. And then you could say Rubery Owen, which also adopted the BRM project, which was kind of flawed from the get-go when it was this designed by committee organization way back in the 40s. But it was like a cat with many lives. It ended up at some point, once the automotive component company, Rubery Owen, pulled pretty much out of that venture, then we find an example where a different type of sponsor comes into the picture. Marlboro, you see the Marlboro BRM as a part of a specimen here in the same image. And that would be one way, but that sponsorship was not really contributing to the technical development, and it was pretty feeble because they went from one car company to the next, and sometimes they supported more than one, but it wasn't enough to stay alive. So what I'm proposing, and again, this is a bit of a leap of faith that you may want to follow me with or not, I think in Italy there was enough potential, there was enough passion to get big time into Grand Prix racing, but it would take that financial underpinning of a larger company. We knew Fiat would not participate. They were never interested after their successes in the 1920s to go back into GP racing. So it takes a conglomerate, a firm, very similar to the Auto Unione that we had seen prior to World War II. I suggest in Italy there should be the establishment of an Unione Automobili, a Finmeccanica company, part of the IRRC, which was a public holding company in Italy that had picked up previously in the 1930s already Alfa Romeo when they were in hard times. And so Alfa Romeo was already part of this holding company. I submit, when you look at the categories here and the brands that Auto Unione had, then Alfa Romeo probably would be an equivalent to Wanderer. The DKW, I'm struggling a little bit with it. I think Iso Rivolta, and the Isetta would be an interesting play. I think also since DK W always had motorcycles as the point of entry for consumers to get into mobile equipment. There may be a play for Vespa in terms of a joint venture, perhaps. Lancia would be the upscale part, not trying to compete with Alfa Romeo. That would be fairly senseless. There may be some overlapping, some platform sharing that I could see, even with the eyes of somebody in the early 1950s. There may be in this low-cost segment a play for Panhard out of France, but in those days having multinational corporations was probably not very feasible yet. So that's a bit of an open question. Maybe you've got better ideas for that. And I add also a category, and we'll soon see why that is significant. And I'm not really talking about mid-engined race cars, as you recognize. I'm building a platform that allows that technology to really take place in a big scale. I submit also tractors could play a role. And there is a play for the Same tractor company that also has a long history of being connected to Alfa Romeo, because the Cassani brothers that formed Same had previously formed Spica. Some of you may know they were the Italian equivalent of Bosch in fuel injection. And so these tractor guys, they needed for their diesel engines something to get the fuel into the combustion chambers. And since with the autarky policy, they couldn't just go to Bosch in Stuttgart and get their stuff. They built their own version. And they got then into ERE and were delegated into the Alfa Romeo fold in the 1930s, 1940s already, because it was seen that they were more relevant with their technology. Now, the people that were coming from the tractor faculty did not match very well to the more structured corporate environment, and they left pretty soon and formed their own tractor company again, which became very successful and exists still today, headquartered in Treviglio, Italy. So I put these elements together in some way, because so far there's perhaps a good story if you believe that this Unione Automobili could come into being. But of course, in every good story, there are heroes and there are villains. And I think a very obvious villain, kind of the white elephant in the room, is that one. Fiat would probably not sit still and say, oh, this is nice, there's a new competitor being formed, and public money goes into that also. So somehow Unione Automobili would have to create a competitive advantage that was compelling, particularly to the politicians of that time. Because Fiat had clout in the political space at the time, and had that for decades. So one of the things Fiat was not terribly interested in was helping to sustain or to develop the Mezzogiorno, the poorer, lower part of Italy, which was mostly an agrarian society with a lot of manual labor in agriculture. So that's where the slow development comes into play to gradually bring up the technical capabilities and financial wherewithals in southern Italy, rather than putting some of these huge projects into place as had been done and was done later on with steelworks and so on, that became cathedrals in the desert that didn't really fit into the society yet. So I submit that having a tractor, a very simple one, this was the first Same tractor, later on they became much more sophisticated, it would help to transfer manual labor into mechanized forms of agriculture. It would free up labor, but you could also now bring some of the farm boys into mechanics, into working on vehicles on a very low level of complexity. And then later on you could grow that. So you could do something like Ford did when they had ramped up the Model T manufacturing. They established branch office assembly plants or branch assembly plants in different parts of the country. One is still there in building stands still there in Fargo, North Dakota. It's no longer used for its original purpose, obviously. It's a nicely converted office building. But they assembled parts that were shipped from Detroit to these remote areas and helped to reduce shipping costs, for one thing, because when you ship whole cars, you're shipping mostly air. They shipped some parts that came from the mothership, and then there was some local content gradually introduced. So when you do that, you have some more sustainable, gradual development of a more agrarian company. And frankly, people who come from the land, who see the progress that mechanization can bring, they will buy more into this, and they will later on become good mechanics and good people that can assemble more complex vehicles in the South. So also UA or Unione Automobili can leverage state development funds that were available at the time, the Casa per il Mezzogiorno and the INR Casa for public housing could have been dipped into, particularly if the political communication would have worked well. Now, what you need then for the leadership in this new company would be somebody who's more politically astute, not somebody who is an engineer and loves cars and digs deeply into it. It's probably not the right person who can convince some of the politicians and political powers in place, parties, that it's in their best interest longer term to support this program. And so you find a person in Luigi Rosari who has been a long-term leader within the Pirelli organization. He was responsible for the cable business in Pirelli, not so much for the tires. He was a person with a lot of soft skills. He had honed those during the transition when committees ruled these large corporations for a while in 1946. And so he had good experience in labor relations, which down the road would become invaluable. So he was very much about this gradual and sensible growth of the Mezzogiorno. So I take this, by the way, this is an image of the Fargo Ford assembly plant. It looks way too fancy for what it was made for. And so now we look at the industrial supplier, the component supplier, and we checked in a due diligence process out 4 companies, and the choice is pretty obvious. You know, there are companies that have technical know-how, like these folks that make frames for race cars. They're very specialized in that. They're very good at tubing and forming oval tubing and tapered tubing and so on. Gilco, Auto Telai, very good, but they also work for Ferrari and for Lancia and for whoever pays them. So you don't want to really get them too close to what you're doing with your new concept. Olivetti is certainly interesting from a technology perspective because they were getting into digital computation at that time already, the typewriter folks, obviously. And so long term they may be interesting, but short term they were also a little bit of an utopian company. Pirelli, an obvious choice. Montecatini, a large chemical company, could play a role in that they wanted to get into the automotive industry, so they could leverage perhaps this entry point, and that may be good. But since we know that tires are so essential for the success of race cars, and Pirelli had a long-term success with their bias ply tires, conventional tires in racing. They won world championships up to that point, and they also developed a radial tire already since '49. So that kind of prompts me to think, why not introduce radial tires to racing, to Grand Prix racing, at this early point of entry? it would be doable, I think, and Pirelli would see benefits from doing that. It would become a centerpiece of their marketing campaign to show that radial tires can work under the most harsh and demanding conditions. They would have enough skin in the game in this project, because if they lose, that doesn't look good for them. But on the other hand, of course, these tires, compared to the previous ones, require a different driving style. So there is something to learn for the people that run these cars. In essence, the slip angle gets much smaller for a given lateral force. But Pirelli has the opportunity to become also Unione Automobili's preferred tire supplier. There's a volume business in the background. And this is a depiction, obviously, of the radial tire, the Cinturato. But we need a technical head. So we switch scenes here, and we go to Burton-on-Trent in the UK. You may ask, why do we do that? Well, there is an interesting person to be met, and that's, again, our friend Robert Eberan von Eberhorst, who was involved in the Auto Union activities. He also oversaw the Cisitalia construction in Torino. And so he's being invited by the Pirelli UK office for a chat. At the time, he was in England. He worked as the chief engineer at Aston Martin, the company that was then owned by David Brown. He had been lured into England to work at ERA, but according to his own words, that proved to be a disaster, a real disappointment, because they didn't nearly have the resources that he was used to. At Aston Martin, it wasn't much better. So the leadership of Unione Automobili talks him into coming back to Italy instead, leave this misery in England behind, and don't get tempted by this new Auto Union, because that's what he will do in reality. He will find that the lower ranks in the company really don't like him, and even some of his peers on the upper echelon despise him, because he's a little bit too far out there for their taste. So I suggest this new scenario has Eberan Eberhorst become the technical director and responsible for the GP project at Unione Automobili. And by doing that, we combine this analytical spirit, the scientific approach to race car engineering, with the passion of the Italians and with the willingness to experiment. The car concept is somewhat influenced by the Cisitalia 360. It's, although less complex, for example, I don't think the four-wheel drive solution was already appropriate, or may never be in such a car, and I would place the gearbox behind the differential, behind the rear axle, which would increase the polar moment of inertia in the yaw mode a bit and would make the car a little bit more drivable. The seating position would be more reclined than in the Cisitalia, which in a way was still old school, but it had already a good space frame, so we use that. We extend the cockpit so that the driver can lean back a little bit. It makes a lot of sense to use a V6 engine, because Lancia and its fame was built around V6 engines. There were interesting engineers like the Virgilio, who came up with the 60-degree equal firing order distance or angle V6, which at the time was not well known or was not practiced, but he introduced that successfully to Lancia, and there were other folks from the Lancia team that would have been useful. I submit, of course, the engine would have double overhead camshafts, and it would have a Spica fuel injection system, and you don't want to overfreight a new project with too many features that are new and unproven. So for exploratory purposes, they should dabble with pneumatic valve springs to have an alternative to the desmodromic valve train that Mercedes had introduced or would introduce. So the V6 with a volume of 2.5 liters, rated speed and piston speed in particular was well within the realm of possibilities of that time. So I'm not exaggerating too much. This would be a pretty competitive project. It would be a good chance to introduce disc brakes, preferably from Girling, that were readily available and somewhat proven. I think the anti-roll bar introduction to GP cars was long in coming and should be introduced here for sure. Then again, the exploration to future upgrades could be devoted to a monocoque chassis and, more importantly, to the introduction of aerodynamic downforce. So this is a very rough back of an envelope sketch of this Grand Prix car. In hindsight, it would look like something is nothing special. Again, why did it take so long? From today's perspective, it's easy to say. When you were living in 52 or 53, it was a little bit more of a stretch of imagination, but not totally uncalled for. John and Charles Cooper in England had been working on these kinds of concepts already, and Conode had its own program going on. This is one of the pictures of their prototype. They were waiting for the Godiva Coventry Climax engine, the V8 engine, to become ready, and they would have put it into the back of their car, and it would have been a very interesting Challenger. But Coventry Climax got cold feet. They thought the engine wasn't powerful enough when they heard of 300 horsepower plus that Mercedes would be delivering, which they never did. And so they decided to deep six their very impressive V8 engine program. So this is what the rough concept looked like. I don't want to get into much detail because that's left to the engineering team. Now, when you have so many unknown parts in your car, you want to de-risk your project. And here I introduce another player, Rudolf Ruska, who had been working with Cisitalia, with Porsche. So he was part of the inner team already, and he would be tasked with providing a test mule. That would be a car that would not look like a Grand Prix car yet, but the underpinnings would be exactly that, and you could introduce new technologies gradually and expose the drivers to the new driving characteristics and working with disc brakes and radial tires in a very disguised way. You could do data acquisition and learn about the optimization of this new package. So he was a good player for doing that. He had good connections to the carrosserias. Touring had already worked for Montecatini, previously mentioned, on this little prototype with a resin fiberglass combination bodywork, and so we suggest they should just do something like this and use that as the test mule and run it in Monza and on other tracks. And Ruska will later on lead a project that will unify the platforms of the Giulietta of Romeo and the Appia of Lancia to save costs, to get economies of scale, and this project should be successful. Now, we talk about advanced aerodynamics, and when we think of wings, we think that's something that happened very recently with Chaparral and Jim Hall, perhaps, or maybe Michael May in Switzerland in the mid-50s. But in the late 30s, when Mercedes wanted to build this T80 world record car, they had already experimented. This was, again, a design of the Porsche engineering firm. They had already dabbled with the thought of wings, fixed wings, even movable flaps here. And this is all discoverable in late open patent applications and patents that were accessible to people, certainly in the 1950s. So this fellow here, Josef Mickl, was a member, founding member of the Porsche engineering team in Stuttgart. His background was aeronautical and mechanical engineering, and he had a specific interest in the aerodynamics. So these patents are very interesting to read and very visionary. Okay, so I'm getting to the end, thank you, because we need also drivers, obviously, in order to make this a successful project. And here I propose that Alberto Ascari is undisputable the best choice to be driver number one. He was the world champion in 52, 53, and he left Ferrari not for Lancia as in real life, but here he comes to Unione Automobili and will be their star driver. He most likely will not have a splash in the Monaco harbor, and he'll have no reason to drive a sports car of Ferraris on May 26th, 1955, where he fatally crashes. And the second one, just briefly to round this out, we learn from the Rosemeyer experience and bring in somebody from the motorcycle faculty, a two-time world champion that was proven on 500cc motorcycles with Schlera. He won 2 titles, and so he would be an interesting addition to the team because he would bring a different driving experience with him, and analog to Bernd Rosemeyer, he may be able to deal with these rear-engined cars better, or mid-engined cars better than, say, drivers that were used to the conventional ones. Anyway, so at the end, the happy end is shown in these 2 bars here. Ascari will not win the 1954 World Championship. That would be too much of a stretch. We leave that to Fangio, but he's a close second. And Massetti happens to win this one Grand Prix, the British one. That was a bit of an aberration with bad weather conditions, etc. So that's pretty much the framework of this story. It brings together the Italian element and some of the Germanic, which is mostly Austrian, to be honest. A lot of the good automotive engineers that work in Germany come from Austria or from former Czechoslovakia. That happened here too. So it's this combination that could accelerate the rear engine or mid-engine revolution. I give it to you to criticize that or tell me I'm totally out of mind. I've done a lot of research to get this put together. There's an underlying manuscript of 100 pages and with real sources, so this is not all just out of thin air. So it has some validity and maybe some believability. But I leave it up to you as the much more experienced folks.
Analysis and a very different approach to all this. History in action. Any quick questions? We're running a little behind right now. I want to get McKinsey up here. Thank you. That was really great. Thank you.